Paul wrote this letter called 1 Corinthians to the Corinthian church to tell them exactly what Jesus did and the implications that it had for their identity. Now, to understand just the context of this, you got to understand what Corinth was like. And this is a world 2,000 years ago in a community that you have probably never visited, and none of us are like Nebula and can go back in time and see what Corinth was like. But I'm just going to tell you one word to describe Corinth, and this will help you get some context for what it was like, okay? It's going to help you. Like, what was this? All right, this one word, Vegas. Okay? I want you to think about Vegas. That's Corinth. Corinth was the Vegas of its day. It was home to a world of sin and a lifestyle, just kind of like Vegas is. Corinth was home to the temple of the Greek goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of sexual love. And it was where people went to get wild. In fact, just like Vegas, Vegas has a saying, right? That everybody knows. You can finish the sentence. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. If 2,000 years ago, if you'd have said to anyone into the Greek culture, if you would have said to live, and they would have said like a Corinthian. You're going to spend a weekend in Corinth so you can live like a Corinthian. Or if you had a weekend in any community, but you had a weekend of just bending boundaries and morality and drunkenness, they said you lived like a Corinthian that weekend. And Paul plants a church in Vegas, in his Corinth. He plants a church there, and people come to Christ. And they receive Jesus, and they become to place their faith in Jesus. But here's the thing about the church community in Corinth. Everybody in the church of Corinth has a past. They grew up a Corinthian. Everybody has a history. Everybody has something that happened in their lives. And the culture around them was beckoning them back to old habits and old behaviors. And Paul hears about this, and he writes them a letter with some tough words, some challenging words, but some beautiful encouragement. I'm going to be reading this today. It's just a short little section in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Now, if you read all of 1 Corinthians, it's got some really detailed kind of teaching about all that was going on in the Corinth community. And if you don't have a Bible, we'd love for you to be able to study this along. There's some bookshelves when you leave. Those are our free gifts to you. And typically, I teach out of the version that we give away there, the NIV. But I'm going to teach today out of a version called The Message. So if you've got your Bible, if you got a hard copy Bible, it might sound a little different. The Message is kind of a modern day and sometimes really poetic and beautiful. And I thought this was really beautiful the way that it says it. This is what Paul starts it out to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, the beginning of verse 9. He writes to all these people in the Corinth church with a past. Don't you realize that this is not the way to live? He's hearing stories of how they're thinking about going back, how they're dabbling in old habits and old lifestyles because they can't get in their mind that they could be anything different than what they've always been. And Paul makes no bones about it. Don't you guys know this is not the way? This is not the way to live. This is not what you were supposed to do. He does not gloss over sin or pretend like sin is not a big deal. It's a big deal. Sin's a big deal. In fact, if it isn't a big deal, then the beauty of what Paul is about to write loses its shine. If sin becomes insignificant, then the cross loses its significance. Paul says sin is really significant. See, that's kind of one of the messages that we get from the world is like, don't worry about your past. Don't worry about what anybody else telling you wrong. Here, you do you. You do you. And Paul says, hey, you doing you is not the way to live. And then he doubles down with some challenging words about the implications of them doing them and me doing me and you doing you. Unjust people who don't care about God, who don't care about God's boundaries, who don't care about God's word, who don't care about God's teaching, who don't care about God's laws, who don't care about the way of God. Unjust people who do wrong because they don't care about God, they will not be joining in his kingdom. And then he goes on to say this: those who use and abuse each other to climb the corporate ladder, to get ahead, those who use and abuse sex and break all the boundaries that God has set forth, those who use and abuse the earth and everything in it and everything it produces, they don't qualify as citizens in God's kingdom. People who do wrong, people who abuse what the earth produces, smoke it, drink it, eat it, people who use and abuse others, people who have colored outside the lines of God's sexual boundaries, people who have been wrongdoers, people who have slandered others online, in person, or behind their back in the closet at work. Anyone, Paul says, who does these actions does not qualify for the kingdom. They do not qualify for a relationship with God. They do not get access to heaven. They do not qualify for the promises to be his children. I promise there's encouragement. Because I don't know about you, but I'm on that list. Paul named. And then Paul, he says this. Can you imagine reading this letter in Corinth? They're Vegas with a past, with a history. A number of you know from experience what I'm talking about. I just imagine they're reading that for the first time. They're like, oh yeah. I know what you're talking about, Paul. Oh yeah, I remember. I'm still struggling, Paul. Yeah, I remember. I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm still dealing with it. I'm wrestling with it every morning. Of this person that I was and these mistakes that I made. But then he says something that's so unbelievable because of one incredible, beautiful, awesome word. One word. For not so long ago, you were on that list. Come on. Somebody say were. Were. You were on that list. You did that. It was in the past. It is yesterday. It is last week. It is last year. You were. But that identity is a lie-identity. It's not who you are. It's not, Paul says. It's not your identity today. It's what you were. And then he says this. Since then. Oh, but Paul, you don't know. I was a liar. I was a thief. Paul, have I told you about the road signs? Paul, I was a gossiper. No. Paul says, since then, you've been cleaned up and given a fresh start by Jesus, our Master, our Messiah, and by our God present in us. That is who you are. You have been cleaned up and given a fresh start, and you are no longer defined by your past, by your sin, your mistakes. You are defined by the Spirit of the living God who lives in you. That's who you are.